Clown statue. I never thought something like this could happen to me. I'm not the kind of person who believes in horror stories, but that night, everything changed. I was 17 years old and had just gotten my first job as a babysitter for a family living in the suburbs of a small town in Illinois. The house was big, a bit old, but well maintained. The parents, a friendly couple, were heading out for dinner and instructed me to put their 2 kids, ages 6 and 8, to bed around 8 p.m. Everything seemed normal, except for one thing. When I entered the kids' room, I noticed a clown statue in the corner. The sight of it gave me instant chills. The statue was large, almost the size of a person, with a painted smile that made me feel uneasy. I thought to myself that it must be some weird decoration, maybe something the kids liked, but there was something about it that made me feel uneasy. I did my best to ignore the statue while I got the kids ready for bed. They didn't seem bothered by it, like they were used to the clown being in their room. I turned off the lights and left, but before closing the door, I took one last look at the clown. Its eyes seemed to follow me, though I knew it was just my imagination. I quickly shut the door and went to the living room. In the living room, I turned on the TV to try and distract myself. I flipped through channels, but my mind kept going back to that statue. Something about it was off. I couldn't focus on anything on the TV. Finally, I decided to call the kids' parents, not to alarm them, but just to ask about the statue, thinking maybe it was some kind of joke or something. When I mentioned the clown statue, the silence on the other end of the line was unsettling. The mother, her voice slightly trembling, asked, "What clown statue?" My heart froze. I explained that there was a clown statue in the kids' room, but she insisted that they didn't have any statue like that in the house. The call ended abruptly, with the mother saying they were coming home immediately. I hung up the phone with a sinking feeling that something was terribly wrong. The silence in the house became overwhelming. The only sound I could hear was my heart pounding in my chest. Suddenly, I heard a scream coming from the kids' room. It was a high-pitched, desperate scream that made my blood run cold. I ran down the hallway toward the room. Each step echoed in the empty corridor, heightening the sense of dread building inside me. When I reached the room, the door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open slowly, my heart in my throat. The room was dark, but I could see that the kids' beds were empty. The clown statue was gone. My hands shook as I turned on the light. The room looked like it had been ransacked, as if something or someone had passed through, leaving chaos in their wake. I called the kids' names, but the only response was absolute silence. On the floor were small, muddy footprints that hadn't been there before. It looked like someone had entered and left quickly, taking the kids with them. I ran through the house, desperately searching for the children, but there was no sign of them anywhere. The house phone rang, and I answered it with trembling hands. It was the mother, asking, almost pleading, what was happening. All I could say was, "They're gone. The statue is gone." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening before it was broken by her desperate sobs. The parents arrived within minutes, but it was already too late. The police were called, and the house was searched from top to bottom. But the kids were never found, and the statue never reappeared. I had to tell and retell my story countless times, and the police looked at me with suspicion. They never fully believed me, but I know what I saw. And what I didn't see. Over time, the town began to whisper about that night. Some people said the statue was actually a man in disguise, maybe a kidnapper. Others believed it was something more sinister, something that defied any rational explanation. But the worst part is that the kids were never found. They simply vanished, as if they'd been taken to another world. Now, every time I hear a child's laughter or see a clown, I feel a chill run down my spine. I can't stop thinking about that night, the kids, and the statue that should never have been there. And I wonder, where are the children now? Are they still alive? And who, or what, was that horrendous figure? These are questions I'll never have the courage to answer. Bloody Mary. That night, everything seemed normal. We were at Emily's house, just 3 15-year-old girls trying to have some fun on a Friday night. We were in her room, surrounded by pillows and blankets, talking about silly things like boys and the latest funny videos we'd seen online. But then, as always happens at these sleepovers, the conversation took a different, darker turn. It was Sarah who brought up the idea of trying something really scary, something that would mess with our deepest fears. Sarah was always the bravest of the three of us, the one who loved scary stories and was always looking for a new spooky experience. She suggested we try the Bloody Mary ritual, one of those urban legends we all knew about but didn't really believe in. We laughed at first, of course. Who would take something like that seriously? But curiosity started to get the better of us, and within minutes, we were standing in the hallway, in front of Emily's bathroom mirror, with the lights off. The bathroom was cold, despite it being a warm autumn night. The only light came from a candle we had lit and placed on the sink. Shadows danced on the walls, creating a strangely tense atmosphere. Emily hesitated for a moment, but Sarah, always fearless, took the first step. She looked at us with a challenging smile and, in a whisper, said the name we all knew but never dared to say out loud in that context, Bloody Mary. We repeated the name 3 times, just like the legend says, our voices getting quieter with each repetition. After the last time, the silence that followed was almost tangible. We stood there, frozen, waiting for something to happen. At first, nothing did. Just the reflection of 3 scared girls in the mirror, our heavy breathing filling the silence. But then, something changed. I swear I saw a shadow move in the mirror, and it wasn't one of us. Sarah was the first to notice too. Her eyes widened, and she stepped back, pulling Emily with her. And then it happened. In the mirror's reflection, a form appeared, a head covered in blood. The face was distorted, the eyes empty, and the blood seemed to be dripping slowly, as if it were oozing from the mirror. Terror gripped us. We screamed and ran out of the bathroom, tripping over each other as we tried to get away from that sight. Our hearts raced, and none of us could believe what we had just seen. We locked ourselves in Emily's room, trying to process what had just happened. Sarah tried to stay calm, but it was clear she was just as terrified as we were. I couldn't get that image out of my head. The blood-covered face in the mirror, the feeling that something truly evil was in there with us. After a while, we started to calm down, convincing ourselves it had just been our imagination, a trick of the candlelight or something. But the real horror was yet to come. When we finally managed to fall asleep, we were awakened by the sound of footsteps in the hallway. We thought it might be Emily's dad, but when we heard the bathroom door slowly creak open, our fear returned with full force. We stayed silent, holding our breath. I heard the sound of something being dragged on the floor, followed by a faint dripping sound. Finally, Emily's dad knocked on the bedroom door, asking if we were okay. He seemed confused and a little concerned. When we opened the door, he casually asked, "Why is there blood on the bathroom floor?" The shock was immediate. We rushed to the bathroom to check, and there it was. Small drops of blood on the floor, exactly where we had seen the bloody head in the mirror. Panic took hold of us again. Sarah, the most skeptical among us, was as white as a sheet. Emily started crying, and I felt my heart sink with the realization that this wasn't a dream but something very real. Emily's dad tried to calm us down, saying there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe someone had cut themselves and didn't notice, he suggested. But we knew the truth. We knew that wasn't just blood spilled by accident. It was a sign, a reminder of what we had summoned that night. The days that followed were strange. Emily told her parents what happened, but they dismissed it as a trick of the mind or a prank by teenagers. No one else mentioned it, but something had changed between the 3 of us. We avoided mirrors whenever we could, and the friendship that was once so strong began to unravel, as if that experience had created an invisible barrier between us. We never spoke about that night again. Each of us went our separate ways, but the memory of what we saw in the mirror stayed with me. Sometimes, at night, when I'm alone, I still think about it. I avoid looking into mirrors in the dark, afraid of what I might see. And I always wonder, did we really see Bloody Mary? Or was something much worse watching us that night, leaving a bloody reminder to never forget? Since then, the scary stories we used to tell each other seem different. They're not just stories anymore, but terrible possibilities that could be hiding in everyday life. We summoned something we didn't understand, and we paid the price for it. And now, every time I pass by a mirror, I can't help but wonder if we're still being watched, if that blood-covered face is just waiting for the right moment to appear again. That's the truth about that night. A truth that still haunts me, a truth that taught me that some horror stories are more real than we'd like to believe. If you're enjoying the story so far, don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe to the channel for more creepy stories just like these. And hey, have you ever had a paranormal experience? Drop a comment below and share your story with us, we'd love to hear it. Now, let's dive into the next story. Black-eyed children. It was a cold winter night in a small town in rural Maine. The snow was falling heavily, covering everything in a thick layer of silence. My husband, Tom, and I were in the living room, comfortably warmed by the fireplace. The old house we lived in was large and isolated, surrounded by forests that stretched for miles. We had chosen that place precisely for its tranquility, far from the chaos of the cities. But that night, that tranquility took on a sinister air that we would never forget. We were sipping tea and listening to the crackling of the fire when we heard a sound we didn't expect, a knock at the front door. Who could be there, in the middle of a snowstorm, at that time of night? Tom went to the door while I watched from the armchair, a strange feeling in the pit of my stomach. He hesitated for a moment before opening the door, and when he did, it was clear something was not right. 2 children were standing on the doorstep. They couldn't have been more than 10 years old. They wore clothes that seemed outdated, as if they had come from another time. But what really scared me was their eyes. Their eyes were completely black, with no iris, no white, just a dark void that seemed to suck all the light around them. Tom looked at me, confused, but before he could say anything, one of the children spoke. "Can we come in?" "It's cold out here," said the girl, in a strangely monotonous voice. Something inside me screamed not to let them in, but Tom, being the kind man he is, couldn't resist. He invited them in and closed the door behind them. As soon as the children crossed the threshold, the temperature in the room seemed to drop even more, as if the fireplace was no longer there. The children sat on the couch without saying another word. Tom tried to make conversation, asking where they were from and where their parents were, but they just sat there, motionless, with those black eyes fixed on us. The unease inside me only grew. Something was terribly wrong, but I couldn't put it into words. We went to the kitchen to discuss what to do, but the words wouldn't come out right. It was like a fog had settled in our minds. Suddenly, we heard a strange noise coming from the yard. It sounded like something was moving in the snow. We went to the window, and to our surprise, we saw our cats, who always stayed inside during the winter, wandering outside. But they weren't behaving normally. They moved erratically, as if they were disoriented. And then, one by one, they began to disappear into the darkness of the forest without even looking back. We tried to go outside to get the cats, but the children, who had gotten up without us noticing, were standing at the kitchen door, blocking our way. "Don't go outside," said the boy, his voice now carrying a more threatening tone. It was at that moment that the feeling of fear became unbearable. Something else was happening, something beyond what our eyes could see. Tom began to cough violently, something that had never happened before. He leaned against the counter, looking weak and pale. I ran to him, trying to help, but the children just stood there, watching, as if it was all part of some macabre plan. Panic took over me, but before I could react, there was a knock at the front door again. 2 men were standing outside, their dark figures barely visible through the blizzard. When I opened the door, I felt a chill run down my spine. The men seemed wrong, as if they didn't belong to that place or that time. They didn't introduce themselves, didn't say their names. They just looked at the children and said, "It's time to go." The children turned to us, and for the first time, I saw them smile. A cold smile, devoid of any human warmth. Without saying another word, they walked to the door and left with the men, disappearing into the darkness of the night. The door closed with a final thud, leaving Tom and me in silence, paralyzed with fear and confusion. The days that followed were a blur. Tom didn't get better, his cough turned into something worse. He lost weight rapidly and seemed to age every day. We took him to the hospital, but the doctors couldn't find an explanation for the illness that was consuming him. It was like his life was being drained, and nothing they did could stop it. The cats never returned. And the few neighbors we had started to avoid us, whispering when we passed by. It was like we were marked by something everyone sensed but no one dared to name. Every day, the feeling that something evil was still watching us grew. Finally, after weeks of agony, Tom passed away. He went quietly, as if he had simply given up fighting against that invisible force. I was left alone in the house, surrounded by snow and emptiness. And even after everything, I couldn't leave immediately. It was like something was holding me to that place, an invisible force that wouldn't let me go. One day, I found a small piece of paper on the doorstep. There was no one around, and I couldn't understand how it had gotten there. On the paper, there was just one sentence, written in a child's handwriting, almost like a farewell note: "We'll be back." I dropped the paper immediately and ran into the house. I locked all the doors and windows, but deep down, I knew it wouldn't help. Today, looking back, I can't explain what happened that night. All I know is that since then, I live with the constant fear that, at any moment, I might hear a knock on the door again. And if that happens, I know there will be no escape. This is the story of how a quiet night in rural Maine turned into a living nightmare, a true horror story that I'll never be able to forget. If you hear unexpected knocks on your door on a winter night, think twice before opening it. Because some visitors bring more than just cold and darkness, they bring true horror, the kind that seeps into your life and never leaves. This is the kind of real scary story I wish I never had to tell, but here I am, trapped in the memory of a terror that still haunts me. Playing with the Ouija board. It was supposed to be just another sleepover. Jessica, Megan, Claire, and I gathered at Megan's house, like we did almost every month. That particular night, the wind was howling outside, and Megan's house, an old Victorian building, seemed even older and full of secrets. Everything started as usual: movies, popcorn, and laughter. But after midnight, when the city lights began to dim, Megan suggested something different, something I never imagined we would do. She pulled out a dusty box from the back of the closet, revealing a Ouija board. "I found it in the attic," she said with a smile that tried to be brave, but there was a shadow in her eyes. Claire and Jessica were immediately excited, but I felt a shiver run down my spine. I've always been skeptical, but something about that board made me uneasy. I refused to participate, saying I'd rather just watch, but it didn't matter. They were determined to play with the unknown. I sat in the corner of the room, hugging my knees, while they lit candles and turned off the main lights. The room was plunged into a strange dimness, where the shadows seemed to move on their own. Megan, Jessica, and Claire kneeled around the board, placing their hands on the wooden planchette, which seemed more sinister than anything else in the room. They began asking questions in low voices, as if they were trying not to be heard. At first, nothing happened. They laughed nervously, exchanging glances, maybe a little disappointed. But then, the planchette started to move. Slowly, as if something invisible was pushing it. "Who's there?" Megan asked, her voice now slightly trembling. The letters began to form: N-O-T-H-I-N-G. "Nothing," Claire said, laughing, but the laughter quickly died out when the planchette moved again, this time faster. The questions continued, and the board responded with short, cryptic messages. Meanwhile, I watched, growing more uncomfortable by the minute. Then, something caught my attention. On the shelf behind the girls, where Megan kept her collection of old dolls, one of them seemed to have slightly turned its head. I froze, thinking maybe it was just my imagination. But it wasn't. One by one, the dolls started moving their heads, as if they were watching what was happening on the board. My heart raced. I tried to get the girls' attention, but they were so focused on the game that they didn't notice. I knew something was very wrong. Suddenly, one of the dolls, an old porcelain doll with golden hair and a blue dress, fell off the shelf. The sound it made as it hit the floor was loud enough to silence the nervous laughter. The three girls turned to me, expecting me to say something, but I was in shock, unable to form words. "This isn't funny, Claire," Megan said, thinking she had knocked the doll over on purpose. But Claire was as pale as I was. "I didn't do anything," she replied, her voice barely audible. Before we could argue further, another doll fell, followed by two more, as if pushed by invisible hands. That was enough for me. I got up quickly, saying we should stop, that this had gone too far. Megan, however, seemed hypnotized. She insisted on continuing, wanting answers. "Who is here?" she asked again, this time more firmly. The planchette started to move erratically, so fast that the girls could barely keep up with it. Then, all the dolls fell at the same time, scattering across the floor. Panic took over us. Without thinking twice, we ran out of the room, leaving everything behind, including the board. The candles were still burning, and the room seemed to have grown darker, denser, as if something had filled the empty space we left behind. We huddled in the living room, trying to calm down, but the feeling that something was terribly wrong wouldn't go away. That's when Jessica, the most superstitious among us, whispered, "We didn't close the session." My blood ran cold. I knew what that meant, even though I never believed in such things. Leaving a Ouija session open was like leaving your front door unlocked, inviting anything to come in. I tried to argue that it was just a game, that all of this was just a coincidence, but my words sounded hollow, even to me. We decided to go back to Megan's room, but when we got to the door, we hesitated. The room was quiet, but there was something oppressive in the air, as if the house itself was holding its breath. We entered slowly, and what we saw made us stop in our tracks. The board was in the center of the room, the planchette resting in the middle, but all the dolls, which had been on the floor, were now neatly arranged on the shelf again, perfectly aligned, all staring directly at the board. No one had the courage to approach. We left the room, blew out the candles, and locked ourselves in the living room until dawn. None of us slept that night. When the sun finally came up, Megan's house seemed safer, but the memory of what had happened was still fresh in our minds. The next day, when Megan's parents returned, we didn't say anything about what had happened. Life went on, but something inside us had changed. Megan tried to go back to the room later to close the session, but the board had disappeared. She asked her parents, but no one knew where it was. That disturbed us even more. In the weeks that followed, small things began to happen. Megan said that sometimes, at night, she heard whispers coming from the room. Jessica started having nightmares about the dolls, and Claire ended up moving to another state. As for me, I never entered a house with a Ouija board again. Believe it or not, some doors, once opened, never fully close. This experience showed me that not everything we consider a game is harmless. And that some of the scary stories we heard as children might have more truth to them than we're willing to admit. Sometimes, it's better to leave certain mysteries unsolved before it's too late. And always close the session. The Rake. I never believed in horror stories. I always thought they were just that, stories. Something to scare us before bed, but with no truth to them. However, what happened to me that night completely changed my view of the inexplicable. I still tremble when I recall the details, and there are nights when I simply can't close my eyes, afraid of what I might see again. I'm sharing this with you because, even if no one else believes me, I need someone to hear what happened. It was early summer, and I had decided to spend a few days at my family's country house in the Catskills, New York. It was a peaceful, isolated place, perfect for disconnecting from the hustle and bustle of the city. My parents always said it was our refuge, where nature reigned supreme, and the only sound you could hear at night was the chirping of crickets. I always loved that place, but during my last visit, something changed. On that particular night, everything seemed normal. I had spent the day exploring the surroundings, walking along the trails that wound through the dense forest. The air was fresh, and the sky was clear. When night fell, the darkness seemed even deeper than usual. I decided to go to bed early, taking advantage of the silence for a restful night's sleep. Little did I know I wouldn't sleep at all that night. I woke up in the middle of the night for no apparent reason. The clock next to the bed read 3:15 a.m. The house was plunged into absolute silence, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I was about to go back to sleep when I heard something that shouldn't have been there. It was a soft sound, a subtle scratching coming from outside the bedroom window. I thought it might be some animal. In that area, it was common to hear raccoons or even deer wandering around the property. But this sound was different, more persistent, almost human. My heart began to beat faster, and a sense of unease took over me. Something inside me told me not to move, not to look, but curiosity got the better of me. I slowly got up, trying not to make any noise. I walked over to the window and, with great care, pulled the curtain back just enough to peek outside. That's when I saw it for the first time. A creature, crouched on the lawn in front of the house, with pale, almost translucent skin. It was hunched over, its bones jutting out as if they were about to tear through its skin. But what terrified me the most were its eyes, black and empty, fixed directly on me. I was paralyzed. I couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. It knew I was there, watching me, and those eyes. It was like it was peering directly into my soul. Time seemed to crawl as I stood there, frozen, hoping it would go away. But it didn't move. It just kept staring at me, as if it were waiting for something. Finally, as if waking up from a nightmare, I managed to take a step back and let go of the curtain. My body was trembling uncontrollably, and I felt nauseous, like I had just escaped something very, very wrong. I curled up in bed, pulling the covers over me like a child trying to hide from a monster. But I knew this wasn't a dream, and it was out there, waiting. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, that maybe I was too tired, or that fear was playing tricks on me. But the sound of scratching at the window continued. Louder this time, more desperate. I was on the verge of breaking down when, suddenly, everything stopped. The silence returned, but it didn't bring comfort, only a sense that something terrible was about to happen. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, waiting for dawn, counting every minute that passed. When the first rays of sunlight finally began to fill the room, I summoned the courage to get up and look out the window again. Outside, the lawn was empty, but there was something strange in the air, a feeling that it wasn't over. When I opened the front door to check the exterior, I saw deep marks in the ground, as if something had been dragged into the forest. In the days that followed, I tried to forget what had happened, but the memory was always there, like a shadow that followed me wherever I went. I talked to some locals, people who knew those forests better than anyone. One old man, in particular, seemed to know more than he was willing to share. When I mentioned what I saw, he just looked at me with tired eyes and said, "Some things are better left alone." That's how I first heard the name the Rake. A creature that many consider an urban legend, an invention of the internet, but which actually seems to have much deeper and older roots. Stories about it have existed for centuries, described as an entity that stalks its victims, watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. I became obsessed with those stories, trying to find anything that could explain what I had seen. But the truth is, nothing I read or heard could prepare me for the visceral fear I felt that night. The Rake isn't just a scary story, it's something much worse. It's a presence that can't be explained, only felt. Something that shouldn't exist, but somehow finds its way to us, feeding on our fear and despair. Today, when I'm alone at night, especially in isolated places, that feeling returns. The sensation of being watched, followed. I try to live my life normally, but there's a part of me that knows this isn't over. And maybe, one day, I'll look out the window again, and it will be there, waiting. And I can only hope that, this time, I have the courage not to open the curtain. Because some horror stories, no matter how much we wish they were just stories, are much more real than we're willing to believe. And the rake is one of them. It's not an urban legend, it's not an invention of internet forums. It's a true horror, a chilling tale that hides in the shadows, waiting for those who dare to cross its path. Possession by Duende. I never thought I'd experience something that would challenge everything I believed to be real. Growing up, I heard terrifying stories from my grandmother during stormy nights. Tales of ancient creatures, vengeful spirits, and curses no one wanted to invite upon themselves. But like any modern young person, I always saw these stories as just that, tales meant to scare kids. That was until something happened to my cousin, Hannah, that made me reconsider. It was a typical weekend, and as usual, we were spending a few days at our grandparents' house in rural Virginia. The place was peaceful, surrounded by rolling green hills and a dense forest that seemed to hide ancient secrets. On that day, we decided to explore the surroundings, as we had done since we were kids, but something about that walk would stay with us forever. Hannah and I were walking through the forest, laughing and enjoying the cool breeze that rustled the leaves of the trees. We were following a familiar trail when we came across a large anthill, partially hidden among the roots of an old tree. It wasn't unusual to see things like that around there, but that day, something felt different. I sensed it, but I chose to ignore it. Hannah, always the braver one, didn't think twice before stepping beside the anthill, wanting to get past the small obstacle. But the moment her foot touched the ground, something strange happened. She stopped abruptly, as if she had felt a sharp pain, but what came next was even more disturbing. Her expression changed, the eyes that had been sparkling with excitement became glazed, as if something had taken hold of her. At first, I thought she was playing a joke. Hannah always loved pulling pranks, but there was something in the way she stood, motionless, that made me uneasy. I started calling her name, but she didn't respond. Her lips began to move, murmuring words I couldn't understand, and then, suddenly, she dropped to her knees, her hands clutching the ground as if she were in deep agony. I was paralyzed for a moment, fear rising inside me. All I wanted was to run for help, but something kept me there, as if an invisible force was telling me I couldn't leave her alone. Then, out of nowhere, she started speaking, but the voice wasn't hers. It was deeper, rougher, like something was using her mouth to communicate. Words in an unknown language poured out of her, while the wind around us seemed to pick up, bringing with it a strange chill that didn't match the warm weather of the day. I didn't know what to do, and panic started to overwhelm me. I remembered the stories my grandmother used to tell about the duendes, small spirits that inhabited isolated places and, according to legend, could be either benevolent or malevolent. Never anger them, my grandmother always said. They can be vengeful if disturbed. At that moment, a horrible feeling told me that we had done just that. With trembling hands, I began to pull Hannah, trying to drag her away from the anthill, but she was heavy, as if something was holding her down. The words kept coming from her mouth, now mixed with groans of pain. Finally, in a desperate act, I remembered what my grandmother had taught us: if a duende is disturbed, offer fruits and salt as an apology. I ran back to the house, my heart pounding so fast I could barely breathe. When I returned, carrying a basket of fruits and a handful of salt, Hannah was lying on the ground, motionless, as if she had fainted. With my heart in my throat, I placed the fruits beside the anthill and sprinkled the salt around it, murmuring a prayer my grandmother had taught me. I waited, time seemed to drag as the silence of the forest became oppressive. Then, something incredible happened. Hannah's body twitched, and she began to cough, as if trying to expel something from inside her. Her eyes slowly returned to normal, but they were confused, as if she didn't know where she was. The voice that came out now was hers, weak but recognizable. She looked at me, not understanding what had happened. "What was that?" she asked as I helped her up. I tried to explain, but the words seemed small and inadequate to describe the terror I had witnessed. We returned to our grandparents' house in silence, and I felt like something had changed forever. Hannah didn't remember anything that had happened, just a strange feeling of being watched before she passed out. When we told our grandmother, she wasn't surprised, just concerned. She said we were lucky to remember to offer the fruits and salt, as the spirit might not have been so merciful. Since that day, Hannah and I never again underestimated the real scary stories that grow around ancient superstitions. We learned to respect nature more, aware that there are forces beyond our understanding. That experience showed me that the scary stories I heard as a child aren't just to make us sleep with the lights on. They carry ancient lessons, passed down from generation to generation, warnings about the dangers lurking in places we cannot see. Hannah fully recovered, but I know something has been watching us since that day, something that prefers to stay in the shadows, waiting for any slip to manifest itself again. Now, when I hear a scary story, I don't allow myself to doubt. Because I know, with absolute certainty, that the unexplainable is always lurking, ready to remind us that there's much more in the world than our eyes can see. And sometimes, these real scary stories are more than just legends. They are warnings, ones we ignore at our own risk. The Legend of Hachishaku-sama. When I was a child, I used to spend my summers at my grandparents' house, in a small village in the mountains of Japan. Those months were the most anticipated of the year, filled with innocent adventures, running through rice fields and exploring the dense forests surrounding the village. It was a place where time seemed to stand still, where the modern world had yet to fully arrive, and old traditions were still respected. But one of those visits marked my life in a way I will never forget. I was about 9 years old when it happened. It was a hot summer afternoon, and I was playing in my grandparents' garden, trying to catch dragonflies lazily flying under the sun. My grandmother called me inside for tea, but before I could respond, something caught my attention. In the corner of the garden, near one of the ancient trees, I saw a woman. She was incredibly tall, much taller than anyone I had ever seen. Her abnormal height left me mesmerized. The woman was dressed in a white kimono, which seemed to float around her, and had long black hair that almost touched the ground. But what disturbed me the most was her face. It was pale, expressionless, and her eyes seemed empty, as if there was nothing there. She looked directly at me, and for a moment, I was frozen, unable to move or look away. Then, she opened her mouth and made a deep sound, almost like a distant drum, thump. The sound reverberated through the garden, and my heart raced. Somehow, I knew this wasn't normal, that this wasn't just any person. When I finally managed to move, I ran inside, breathless, and told my grandmother what I had seen. I expected her to laugh or tell me it was just my imagination, but instead, her face turned pale, and she quickly took me to my grandfather, who was in the living room. They exchanged looks that I couldn't understand at the time, but now I realize were of pure terror. My grandfather asked me several questions, all in an urgent tone, where I had seen her, what she had said, what she looked like. When I finished telling him, he sighed deeply and said just one word, Hachishaku-sama. At that moment, I didn't know what it meant, but I saw the fear in my grandparents' eyes and knew it was something very serious. My grandfather, without wasting time, started making phone calls and muttering words in Japanese that I couldn't understand. Meanwhile, my grandmother took me to a room at the back of the house, a place I rarely went. It was a small room, with a wooden sliding door, decorated only with a futon and a few traditional objects. She asked me to lie down and then began to sprinkle salt around the futon and placed a bowl of rice and a candle in the corner of the room. My questions were ignored. She only told me to stay there and not to leave, no matter what happened. The fear in her voice made me obey without hesitation. As she closed the door, I heard my grandfather outside, speaking to someone who seemed to have just arrived. The conversation was tense and in whispers, which only heightened my fear. I couldn't understand what was happening, but I knew something was terribly wrong. The hours that followed were the longest of my life. The silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional sound of footsteps outside the door. I don't know how long I stayed there, but with each passing minute, I felt as if something was getting closer. I can't say for sure if it was just my imagination, but I swear I heard that sound again, thump, echoing in my mind, as if the entity was calling out to me. Eventually, the door to the room opened, and my grandmother entered, looking relieved but still tense. She told me that I needed to leave the village immediately and that I couldn't return, at least not for a long time. I didn't understand why there was such urgency, but I did as she said. I was sent to stay with some relatives in another city, and from there, I returned to the United States, where my parents lived. Before I left, my grandparents told me never to return to Japan, and although it saddened me, I eventually accepted it. I grew up trying to forget that summer, trying to convince myself that it was just a real scary story my grandparents had created to frighten me. But the memory of that tall woman and the sound, thump, never left me. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I can still hear that sound, as if she's trying to find me again. Years later, when my grandfather became ill, I wanted to return to Japan to say goodbye. However, my family insisted that I shouldn't go, reminding me of my grandparents' words. When he passed away, I felt an immense emptiness, as if something had been torn from me. Still, I didn't return. My grandmother wrote to me shortly before her death, saying that Hachishaku-sama was still watching me, that she never forgets her victims. Today, I try not to think about it too much, but I know that somehow, this entity still influences my life. The fear I felt that night when I first saw her never completely disappeared. And even though I try to ignore it, part of me knows that Japan, that place where I spent so many happy summers, will never be safe for me again. This experience made me realize that some real scary stories we hear as children have deeper roots than we imagine. Sometimes, what we think is a legend or superstition is actually a warning, a caution to stay away from things we cannot fully understand. And Hachishaku-sama, with her threatening thump, is one of those stories I wish I had never encountered. Akamanto. I never really believed in urban legends, but after that night, my perspective changed completely. It all happened during my senior year of high school, at the school I attended. It was an old building with narrow hallways and dim lighting. The school already had its stories, and one of the most popular was the legend of Akamanto, the bathroom spirit. It was a Friday afternoon, and I stayed late at school to finish a project. The library was almost empty, and when I realized it was nearly 8 p.m., I decided to leave. But first, I needed to use the bathroom. The only one open was at the end of the hallway on the 3rd floor, an area I always found a bit eerie. When I entered the bathroom, I noticed it was completely empty, and the lights were flickering slightly, as they always did. I went to the last stall, out of habit, and closed the door. The silence was so deep that I could hear my own breathing and the sound of my heart beating faster than usual. While I was there, I felt a strange sensation, as if I was being watched. Suddenly, I heard a soft, whispering voice. It was almost like the wind, but the words were clear, red paper or blue. Frozen, it took me a moment to process what I had just heard. It was the legend of Akamanto. My mind was panicking, but I knew what the story said. If you chose red, you would be stabbed until you were covered in blood. If you chose blue, you would be strangled until you were out of breath. With a dry throat, I replied, almost breathlessly, neither. Silence fell again. For a moment, I thought it was over. But then, the voice returned, closer this time, almost beside me, choose, or I'll choose for you. I could feel my heart pounding violently in my chest. There was no easy way out. I remembered a friend who told me, jokingly, that if you said, I don't want either, or tried to run, you might escape. But running seemed impossible. All I could do was scream desperately, I don't want anything. Suddenly, the stall became icy cold, and I felt as if something was about to touch me. I closed my eyes and began to pray, hoping it was all just a nightmare. When I finally gathered the courage to open my eyes, I realized the bathroom was eerily quiet. The voice had vanished, and the air was still again. I hurried out of the stall, still trembling, and ran out of the bathroom without looking back. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept returning to that moment, wondering what might have happened if I had answered differently. I never used that bathroom again, and to this day, I avoid places where I feel like I'm being watched. I don't know if what I encountered was real or just a figment of my imagination. But the fear I felt that night was the most intense I've ever experienced, and that's something I'll never forget. If you enjoyed these true horror stories, you won't want to miss the next video. Check out the demonic Goatman's Bridge by clicking the card on the screen or by finding it as the previous video on our channel. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know in the comments if you've ever had a paranormal experience. We'd love to hear your stories. Stay brave, and we'll see you in the next video.